once you hit.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name's Todd Rankin. I'll be co-teaching with Chris Donaldson. This will be our second round together in this course. So I'll turn it over to Chris for a quick intro, and then I'll jump into the start of our unit.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Chris Donaldson, currently work as a regional fuels coordinator for the Pacific Northwest region. Been here for about a year. Started down the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest and then moved up to the Northwest Oregon Interagency Program. Yeah, very Oregon-centric. Been doing a lot of implementation, on the east side and in the southeast, Region 8. But yeah, definitely Forest Service and in some ways west side centric. So thanks, Todd.
All righty. Like I introduced myself the other day, I'm Todd Rankin. I started in the Park Service in fire management back in 1994 on an engine crew. I'd gone to school in environmental science, and then I started at Lassen Volcanic National Park down in Northern California. And within the first couple of years of doing fire, I quickly learned that my passion was on the fuels and prescribed fire side, and really related to using fire as a resource management tool and as a natural ecological process. So I've spent most of my career in the fuels and prescribed fire realm, and then being with the Park Service for 28 years, I'm doing a lot of wilderness fire management and allowing fire back into our natural ecosystems. So really been focused on that. I did do a stint as an interagency FMO at Olympic for 6 years. And then I'm currently with the Fish and Wildlife as a regional fuel specialist and trying to sort things out currently on that. So for this fuels management unit, just like all the other information in this course, there's really too much to cover in the time frame that we have. So we're going to try to hit the high points and give you the basic understanding of what it takes to have a well-planned and thought out fuels management program. You're going to be getting a lot of references in here in terms of documents. The Red Book obviously is an anchor point that we use along with all the other policy documents that have been discussed so far. And we'll look at a couple others as well. But really focusing on your roles and responsibilities as agency administrators or FMOs as you move on in your career. So just a general take on this presentation setup. The first half, we're going to really focus on our fuels policy and planning and have discussions on that. And then in the second half, we will kind of focus on prescribed fire and then wrap it up with some reporting requirements there. We really do value discussion, and we're going to be trying to monitor the chat. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat or raise your hand along the way. This is a positive learning environment. We're in day 3. Obviously, we know that the group breakouts, great place for discussion, but also we can have those discussions in the large breakout room. So with that, I'll just go ahead and we'll move on to our objectives. Just like every course, we have objectives. I'm not going to read through these. They're focused on policy, your roles, developing hazard fuel treatments and planning, and then your roles and responsibilities and some of the ins and outs of prescribed fire that you're going to need to know if you don't already, and then wrap it up with some of the reporting tools like I mentioned. So with that, we're going to actually start on a slide of what is a fuels management program. And for this, I went into the Red Book, chapter 17, which is on fuels management. And it provided the definition of the purpose of a fuels management program. And a lot of this is going to start to sound familiar with many of the things that have been discussed so far in the course. Really, the purpose is to reduce hazardous fuels and risks to human communities and improve the health of the land by creating fire resilient landscapes and restoring fire adapted ecosystems. You probably heard some of those key statements in some of the policy that has been discussed. And then the second bullet is really about collaboration, making sure that we're working with our partners, with our communities, and to ensure effective fire management efforts are collectively planned and implemented. We've talked a lot about not only looking at your jurisdictional boundaries are within, but across the landscape. And of course, these are anchored into the policy documents that Loomis covered the other day, the 1995 policy and then the 2009. So we're anchoring into those. But because we're hearing everybody likes to break out into their groups, these are definitions out of the Red Book. What we want to do is take a quick 7 minutes, go to your breakouts, and come back with, what does a fuels management program mean to you on your unit, your values? And then how does it really fit into the big picture of what we're talking about within this course in terms of a fire management program? So let's go ahead and do that. It's 9:38, so let's be back in here at 45 after. Thanks. And Chris, I'm going to 13.
Okay, you got a group, that's right.
Okay. Well, this generated some good discussion within our group, which we're going to start with because as I told our folks in group 13, I don't think we've been picked on yet this week. So we're going to start with group 13.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Isaac Hall. What we really noticed first, or as we discussed, what does fuels management mean to you is the high variability given your location, your district, your forest, your park, for what that means to you specifically. It We discussed the funding source for projects that would otherwise not get done. And it's public facing. There's a tangible product at the end that the public sees. Other things we talked about, blending in interdisciplinary teams for multi-goal projects, good neighbor authorities, and the ability to contract out different projects and the politics involved with prescribed burning.
Great. Thanks, Isaac. And with that, we're going to switch this up and you get to pick the next group.
Oh, just picking a number. Let's go with group 8.
Anybody from group 8?
Yeah, I'll take this one. We talked about how a lot of the times the fuels group goes a lot behind the scenes to deal with a lot of the other department leads, and there's a lot of planning that goes into that, along with planning with the agency administrators and district rangers to prioritize these burn block areas and where to go and what makes sense to them. And a lot of the times we plan burn blocks around, critical fire danger areas to create a catcher's mitt to kind of help us in these situations when we get these big fires.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. A lot of the stuff that we used to do when I was in the Park Service, working at Lassen Park and Crater Lake and Rocky Mountain and stuff, is really planning our fuels treatments to provide that buffer to allow more management of wildfires within like wilderness areas and stuff like that. So, designing them to enhance your decision making with wildfires, if you will. Just opening up for the group. Anybody else have anything before we move on?
Yeah, group 7 here. We agree that what does it mean to us? Number one is it works. There's plenty of examples out there, either from a commercial harvest or just a hazardous fuels reduction, where we've had fire that's come through those subsequently. And you can definitely see a change in the fire behavior. It works. When you get into mixed land ownership, Western Oregon, it's very expensive to do the fuels reduction. It's hard to get a cohesive strategy with the funding sources, the windows of burning, and the clearances and the NEPA. It's very, very difficult to get a big cohesive land management strategy, and we're not keeping up with what's going out there ecologically, just because of the lack in the planning time and implementation time, and just the cost. The cost per acre, of course, is making it real difficult to complete the cycle of treatments on the ground to get that. That's a big picture.
Yeah, and I'd throw in there also the ability to maintain treatments, because all fuels treatments need to have some kind of return interval to maintain that fuel treatment effectiveness, if you will. So I'll throw that out there. Great. Hey, well, yeah, great discussion. And I think hopefully you can kind of see that looking at the fuels management component, it's just part of the programs which make a robust fire management program and give you each one is designed to help hopefully enhance and complement the other. So a good fuels management program will help mitigate risk to values, give you more room, decision space, if you will, and then be treating the land and meeting your mission. So, all right, thanks for that. So moving on. Obviously, the roles and responsibilities are really important. Just given that discussion that we just had, obviously, it's very strategic. We heard that in the report outs, building those relationships and having the interdisciplinary approach is really important. These bullets down here, these are kind of like best management practices. And any program, whether it's a small program on a 5,000 acre or smaller refuge or park or monument, to a 200,000 acre or 2 million acre forest, fuels programs should be integrated with the resources, be strategic, looking at the landscape level, and really foster all that collaboration and the communication. The last bullet I did want to hit on here: reflect current workforce capacity and identify funding needs. That came out as like, yeah, fuels treatments bring in funding. That ebbs and flows, as we know. And right now, yeah, there's a lot of things going on that are, especially, or at least in the fish and wildlife, it's kind of knocking us back in terms of some of the treatments we're looking at doing. But anyway, so that is kind of unpredictable, but it should be something that you think about. Chris, do you have anything before we change it over to you?
No, I think I can just grab it from there. Yeah, a lot of stuff we're already talking about is stuff we're going to continue to talk about, just as far as that variability and what a program can look like, and what your job is to figure out where your program fits in, where it's been in the past, where it's going in the future, which timely for this slide. And I'm not sure if it's just mine, but I'm only getting one of the photos. We should have two photos here. There it is. Okay, it was a time lag. Sorry, I had a brief thought that maybe the slide had broke, but just being impatient. So looking at this photo here, we're talking about what a fuels program should be, could be going to the future. Looking at two different fires on the landscape, the top one there, I started in 2001 with the Forest Service, or actually was with the AmeriCorps program. But that's what a lot of my fires look like for the first 10 years or so. You've got a fire on a hillside. It's pretty much, probably one agency land, or at least all in forest land. You go to a wildfire, you're going to see wildfire apparatus. We got a couple Type 6 engines there. We got some farm fields, maybe a barn. And it's very much focused on a wildland incident. Look at the slide, or the photo below on the slide, and we've got an air tanker dropping in the back of people's backyards. We've got a community that has fire directly threatened by fire and smoke kind of pouring into it. And that's been a change that we've seen really over the last 10 years. Not to say that we didn't have urban interface fires in the past and that there wasn't communities at threat, communities at risk. But it seems like increasingly this is becoming that new normal that we talk about with fires, threatening communities, in communities. Obviously, anyone that's watched the news over the past, month or so, California's always had urban interface fires, had large fires, but it seems like this is kind of something that we kind of expect all the time now. I know for me, the first time I saw Oregon State Fire Marshal coming out, I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of a big deal. Oregon State Fire Marshal's coming out to a fire. Didn't happen too frequently. Even in Western Oregon now, it seems like we're seeing Oregon State Fire Marshal being activated, sending strike teams of structure engines out to places that historically we thought really didn't burn that much. So really just want to acknowledge that conditions are changing. What we thought of as normal just 20 years ago isn't normal now. And the question for us as fuels managers is, well, what do we do with that? What does that mean for our fuels treatments? Does this mean we hyper focus right up against that community? Is that the best place to do fuels treatments? How do we look at what the best place to get the most efficient fuels treatment, the one that's going to work, is going to be? And also bear in mind capacity and all those other limitations that we have. I know I've had county commissioners come to us with hey, we've got this plan, came from some local folks. They took a highlighter and they drew along the forest boundary, fuels treatments that they thought we should go in. And we had to take a look at that and say, hey, there's a time and a place to be doing fuels treatments right up against the community, but our expertise as fire and fuels managers says there's actually a ridge right above that, administrative boundary, because that's a mid-slope line. That's a place that, yes, on a map, maybe it makes sense to do fuels treatments, but our expertise is to say, if we look at that ridge and we look at that road system, that's actually the best place for us to take a stand. So we have a lot of data now. We have the suppression difficulty index. We have potential control lines, all sorts of things that kind of gear us toward where's the best places that we can go and do work on the landscape. And bearing in mind sometimes that, there's great cross-boundary work that we can do in communities on adjacent land ownerships. There's also a time and a place to be doing those big blocks that maybe are a little bit further from town that, as Todd was alluding to, wilderness fires and places that maybe will have large fires in them that we, can foresee potentially coming out of those areas. There's still a lot of good reasons to be doing fuels treatments outside of the WUI. It's not just about the WUI, but that is a big focus we have now as far as how do the treatments that we do now get us so that in slide or the bottom half of this slide, we're doing work that is going to be defensible and is going to help out communities in the future. Okay, next slide. So something that we all have, regardless what agency we are in, is policy. And a lot of that policy is going to be interagency policy. Todd's going to go through a couple of the things in the next slides that are pretty similar to all of us, things that we all follow as far as prescribed fire goes. But there are some differences. And I'll give you one definition of policy I grabbed from the internet. A high-level overall plan embracing the general goals and acceptable procedures. So general goals and acceptable procedures really is what we're kind of looking at here. And the general goals, we kind of hit on already. Most fuels programs, if not all, are going to have those common denominators of, we're looking to reduce fuel loading, increase public safety, increase our ability to manage fire in the urban interface, some basic stuff. But then we also have, on the bottom left there, agency perspective. If you're coming from a state agency, it could be that the protection of private lands, the protection of communities, that is your focus. And maybe the legislature has created some policy and some funding that gives you marching orders to go and do that. And that is your niche, and that's, almost exclusively your niche. Conversely, Todd's experience, with the fish and wildlife, there is a need to protect communities, but there's also a need to invest in habitat. And there could be very specific policy for, maintaining certain things in the landscape in addition to those hazardous fuels reduction projects in the WUI. And then we also have things like agency experience. Recently, the Forest Service had a series of escapes in 2022 that had us give us prescribed fire pause. We stopped prescribed fire operations and kind of looked at, what is going on in the landscape, and we looked at all these things on the left-hand side of conditions, general management goals, science, what environmental changes have happened over the last, X amount of years that cause us to rethink, is what we're doing working? Do we need to change things? So the Forest Service had some policy changes over the last couple of years here with agency administrator engagement, contingency resources, things that we tweak to our burn plan so that while most agencies are working very similar, there are differences in some of those acceptable procedures side of policy. So We're all working toward common goals, but we all have little differences in how we kind of get there. And next slide, which I think I turn it back over to you, Todd. And you're still muted.
Thanks. Yeah, moving along with the interagency policy. I know that the overarching policies have already been covered earlier on Monday, and so I'm not going to go into those, but probably still hearing the common themes, especially with the National Cohesive Strategy. We're going to really be talking about the Red Book and then the Interagency Prescribed Fire Planning and Implementation Guide and the complexity analysis that complements that. So those will be available, and I will make sure to get Megan the PDFs and post those on the portal so you have ready access to those. Otherwise, just you could Google them, or everything's available from links from the Red Book. Within the Red Book, and this is something that when I was an interagency FMO and I was supporting the Forest Service, Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife, every January I would send out a message to the agency administrators that I reported to and say, hey, it's time to review your roles and responsibilities. So we're not going to go into each one of these because it would take too much time, but for whatever agency or bureau you're with, really encourage you to go into those chapters that really define your organization and your roles and responsibilities as either an agency administrator or an FMO, and read through those. And then chapter 17, you could look at that. That really spells out what we're supposed to be doing, and then it has links to all the specific guidance for the different bureaus and agencies. I don't have anything specific for state guidance, but I'm sure that our ODF and DNR folks know where to go find that. So one thing about when I used to go in as an FMO and look at those checklists, there's a lot in there, and especially looking at the three different agencies and the roles and responsibilities, I used to feel a little woozy because it's like, man, am I doing all this stuff? But it's really important. Just use it as a checklist and go in and kind of like make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And again, our agency specific manuals and directives are listed here. We're not going to dive into each. The Red Book, like I mentioned, will have the links to each of those. I recommend everybody go into your agency documents and take a look at those.
Okay,
And then,
so go ahead. I was gonna say back over to me.
Yep.
Cool. So yeah, we've already kind of alluded to this, planning for your fuels program and thinking about, what's realistic on your unit. Thinking about those disturbance regimes, what the historic range of fire variability was, but then also key onto the purpose of that fuels treatment. You may have an area that, historically seen a lot of fire. It fits into fire regime to something that you think you should be underburning all the time. But I think there's also some limitations that we have out there as far as reality with smoke impacts, reality with public acceptance of fire. So I think a lot of what we do in the fuel shop side is to try to take what the science is, what the reality is out there as far as the historic fire regime, and take it and turn it into things that we can actually implement. Which isn't to say you don't want to find places that are hard to burn that you kind of look at. But having that, as it says down there, a strategic plan. What is your decision time and space to say, get that work done and not just do it and get in there and do it once, but can you do that and maintain that in a certain condition? Because we can spend a lot of money doing fuels treatments, but if we can't maintain them, then that investment that we make, we lose over time. So think about, is it something that we need to burn, or what is the role of mastication? What is the role of getting in and doing some hand work? Again, those objectives that we have and making sure that we're not just looking at historic fire regime, but seeing what that condition is and what the opportunities are to get back in there. So there's a lot of places that, you might want to be able to do a lot of prescribed fire in the landscape, but you might have to say, like, this is a fuels break that we're going to put in, because ultimately if we want to stop fire getting into this community, the best thing that we can do and we get it implemented right now is potentially, maintaining our fuel breaks and running some masticators down some road systems. Looking at a landscape maybe that is mixed severity and saying that, there is a role for fire in this landscape, but we know a fire is going to be here at some point, but it doesn't lend itself to something that's easy to underburn frequently. So looking at point protection and just saying, hey, we can do 100 acres around this infrastructure and being okay with that. And just looking at the full range of options that you have as a fuel program manager and knowing when to invest in the landscape with prescribed fire and when to look at some of the tools that we have in our toolbox to maintain the integrity of those places while also, mitigating risk as much as that we can. And I'll go to the next slide. And just to kind of reiterate the difficulty of putting fire in the landscape as frequently and as often as we should, looking at a map here of historic fire regimes. So something I think grabbed at a land fire, but all that pink there on the map, all of Northern California stretching into Southern Oregon, all of the Southeast, and then, blotches throughout the West, should be burning every 35 years, less than every 35 years, really, to that low to mixed severity, which is a lot of fire in the landscape. That big giant red patch in the middle, less than 35 years historically that burned. The Great Plains were Great Plains because they had a lot of fire in them. That kept out brush, kept out trees. I mean, so that alone, without even like talking about the yellow and the light green, is a lot of fire in the landscape. We put millions of acres of fire in the landscape every year through prescribed fire. But that's not to say that it even gets close to the amount of fire that we have that should be out there. And then add into that the fact that we have populations out there. We have all these other things that get in the way of putting fire in the landscape. And we've had changes. This is historic. This isn't necessarily future. So as we talk about climate change and places that maybe burn less frequently, like the Western Cascades in Oregon, burning more frequently, that's adapting and changing. You look at the Great Basin and cheatgrass and the changes in the annual fuels that we have out there, places that maybe burned every 80 years in like the sagebrush ecosystems, they can burn every 5 to 10 years now, even less depending on just how the cheatgrass kind of grows in. And yep, seeing some comments in there. All that stuff is dynamic and it's continually changing. So we absolutely want to look at what the historic range has been, but we need to take that and factor in what our current conditions are. And again, what are our objectives? What can we reasonably do? And what do we want to look like 10, 20, 100 years from now as best as we can? And we'll go to the next slide. In a very simplified way, to look at like how much you should be burning on your unit is to take that land fire data to say, okay, here's the spatial data that says how often these things should be burning. Take how many acres you have and divide it up, and you can get your annual acres treated. So if you're on a ranger district or a unit that has 100,000 acres, and the average year that it should be burning is every 20 years, hey, if you can burn 5,000 acres a year, you're going to be in that mean range of variability. That would be hitting the mark and completely replicating prescribed fire in the landscape or natural fire in the landscape with your prescribed fire program. Of course, it's not that easy. Most landscapes are going to have a mix of severity types. There's going to be all these other things that are kind of keeping you from just saying, take your natural fire, divide it up, and go out and implement. Lots of different things out there that kind of get in our way. But to go to the next slide, what we're looking at in the Pacific Northwest is we've tried to kind of break apart our units into a bit more of a who's historically been where, what are the factors that you have kind of driving some of your limitations, and what are the possibilities to get your more fire on the landscape. So we've blocked off each one of the forests into 3 different groups, basically, for Forest Service Pacific Northwest. We've got timber mechanical-based programs. That's not to say that some of them aren't drier, that there's places on there that are more high fire frequency forests. But we also know as far as a tool that they have in their toolbox, they tend to grow trees, and those trees, if you put them on trucks, will be valuable. So it's not just that we have to sink money into them, but we have that timber management side that you can use as part of your fuels management program to look at ways of creating disturbance, creating fuel loads that you can put fire into, and ways of managing that landscape. So we've talked about some programs that probably have some difficulty figuring out what their niche is. I'll start with the Mount Baker Snoqualmie up there on the top, the first forest. It's a 2 million acre forest, but the mean annual disturbance footprint, how much historically is burned, is only 2,300 acres. However, 2,300 acres would be a lot to annually disturb on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest through just prescribed fire. So looking at that, is that realistic? Can we actually put over 2,000 acres of fire disturbance, particularly when we're talking about not, underburning, but fire on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie and the Western Cascades would be, that mixed to high severity. But we also know historically we've had a bunch of timber sales up there. We've had disturbance on the landscape. We are going to continue to thin through timber. So that's going to create some disturbance on the landscape. We also know that we're going to have natural fires. The Mount Baker's had a few fires recently that's created some disturbance, created some of those natural fire effects. So is it realistic to do 2,300 acres of prescribed fire? No, but we have all these other tools that we can use to create some disturbance and to get some work done on the landscape. And again, we have those little niches. The Mount Baker's done a great job of doing some categorical exclusion projects to look at, we have infrastructure. We can't do big projects, but we can pick places that are very important, and we can do 50 acres here, we can do 50 acres there. So they have been getting some hazardous fuels dollars to do some work that's really valuable work around some places that when we do get that, mixed to high severity fire, we've invested in some places to make sure that we've put their best foot forward for being able to withstand that. And they've also done a really good job out there looking at some other niches like cultural fire, working with the tribes for huckleberry enhancement, all sorts of reasons to be doing good work on the landscape with fire, not just from that hazardous fuels realm. Kind of going down the list, completely different side is you look at the pink high density WUI high fire regime area. Rogue River Siskiyou, 1.8 million acre forest. The mean annual disturbance footprint for that, based on historic range, is 131,000 acres. So again, there's a lot of limitations down there with, it's a hard piece of ground to do prescribed fire on. There's a lot of steep ground down there. There's a ton of communities. That's why it's in our high density WUI. You've got Ashland, Medford, Grants Pass, all the communities on the coast. So can we get 131,000 acres of fire on the ground through prescribed fire? No, but we can look at those opportunities to do work, in specific locations to get thousands of acres of prescribed fire on the ground. And then also looking at the fact that, there's been a lot of fire on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. Some hasn't been the kind of fire effects that we'd be looking for, but a lot of it has. So, we need to celebrate the fact that there's places that we get great fire effects from wildfires and look at that as part of that 131,000 acres. The interesting thing will be as we go forward in the future, can we continue to put fire in those locations? Can we continue to get back to that natural fire regime? In the backcountry, the Kalmiopsis Wilderness, it's burned multiple times in the last few decades. It's probably going to burn a few more times in the decades to come. But can we continue to invest around Medford and Ashland and a lot of those communities that are at risk of having fire right in their backyards? And then the last one I'll point out, the Fremont Wenema on the bottom there, 2.2 million acre forest, mean annual disturbance footprint, 112,000 acres. The Freewind being, a lower density WUI, a little bit further from some places, and also topography-wise lends itself to being able to do a lot of work. Last year, the Fremont Wenema, their accomplishment for fuels reduction was 120,000 acres. About 60,000 acres of that was prescribed fire. So again, we have a lot of places that it's hard to get, good prescribed fire on. The Fremont Wenema is one of those places that we know we can get a lot of fire on the landscape. So they've been a great program that looks at their opportunities, looks at places where they can do a lot of work on the landscape, and it has been, close to meeting that annual disturbance footprint, if not exceeding it. Also a place that from a wildfire perspective, since they've done so much work, they had a fire last spring, within one of their pods that they've done a lot of work around. And instead of beating people up and going and getting that fire, suppressed at, a few acres, we're able to look at that and come up with basically a 7,000 acre block. And within 10 days or so, had burned off 7,000 acres and got to that point that, maybe we think of more with the Park Service, with being able to manage fire and look at fire from a how can we incorporate this into our fuels program, and brought that more into not a 2 month, how do we look at this thing burning in the back wilderness, until it goes out on its own, but how do we just wrap this up into a big prescribed fire and knock this out in 10 days? So I think that's really the future of some of those locations, is being able to take all the fuels work we've done, take our wildfire strategy, and kind of wrap them all up together. And Todd, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, you're throwing out a lot of discussion points we could spend days and days talking about. So, but we'll stay on track for that. So getting back to treatment types and implementation. So we have a lot of tools in the toolbox to use. obviously we have prescribed fire, which is, broadcast burning or pile burning. And then we have the mechanical and manual fuel treatments, and also biological and chemical. And I would just say, just from experience, usually you need a combination of treatments to meet your objectives. I definitely learned that, throwing fire back into an ecosystem that has missed multiple fire return intervals, and not doing anything else might not turn out the way you want it to. Lots of areas, it entails getting in there and doing your mechanical treatments, hand piling or machine piling, and then burning and getting it down to a point, your fuel load, where you can actually put fire back in and use prescribed fire to maintain those areas. But the ultimate goal in many areas. But other treatment options, we have timber harvests. That's a way of thinning, designing it properly. Grazing, mowing. A lot of areas have those fuel breaks, like some of the refuges over in Eastern Washington. I mean, their mainstays, fuel breaks along those highways out there. They stop fires every single year. And so but it's important. Those have to be maintained like every year. The plows have to get out there. So again, getting back to your objectives and how to maintain that fuel treatment effectiveness. And a lot of shaded fuel breaks going on, and then chemicals. So a lot of areas you don't even want to think about putting fire into unless you're going to do a follow-up post-fire with some herbicides to keep invasives out, because invasives are a huge problem. Lawrence commented on that, and invasives have really changed fire regimes and frequency in many areas. So a huge problem to think about in the toolbox. And then, of course, activities that support the treatments. And this came up in our discussion earlier, that a lot of times these activities, the NEPA or the cultural clearances, and the interdisciplinary planning process and all that, those activities are time consuming. And then that's where you're going to really kind of iron out how you're going to locate and sequence your treatments. And then, of course, implementation tools. We have a lot of cooperative agreements, contracts, information. Some of this will be covered in the incident business portion. One thing on the DOI side that just came out this last fall, we finally got a national DOI fuels assist code. And so the bureaus within the Department of Interior could actually go and kind of help each other out without having a bunch of local agreements or regional agreements. Unfortunately, that was bill based, and we're on a full stop on using bill funds right now. So anyway, a lot of stuff. And then we talked about authorities. The good nature or neighbor authority came up, the Wyden Amendment, stuff like that. So that's all in there for us to tap into. But the key on this one, I really think is really focusing on treatment sequencing and proper location, like Chris has identified. And then we wanted to look at some success stories. And this is just an example from the Falls Fire that we brought up. This is actually a screenshot out of the RMA dashboard, and it shows the treatments on the landscape. The yellow is the broadcast burning, and you see the fire perimeter here. And this gets back to locating your treatments. So maybe it will buffer, the areas of high infrastructure or along roadways. What this does, fuel treatments provides firefighters opportunities along the landscape for suppression actions. Either your treatments are going to modify fire behavior and allow them to take action on it. So anyway, going around this fire, you could kind of see a lot of treatments on the landscape and how they've anchored into those. I did want to open it up and kind of ask the group for other additional success stories of fuels treatments that it has either helped stop a fire or reduce the intensity, which we also heard earlier in terms of sometimes the previously treated areas of prescribed burns will have lower intensities than other areas that haven't been treated. So does anybody have a success story for the group?
I could say for us, we have done cultural burns here, and I think it really helped bring a lot of the vegetation that we wanted to come in, be it huckleberries and roots. But I think them areas are also a lot safer if a fire were to come to those areas.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's a lot of areas where there are objectives to use prescribed fire and other fuels treatments to try to bring back the aspen and other deciduous and kind of provide those breaks, which historically would be more kind of provide some at least partial barriers out there on the landscape. So any others? Good to the order?
I think the Schneider Springs fire kind of in the Natchez area from 2021, it shows some pretty good examples. If you look at the fire perimeter map, final fire perimeter, there's a big donut hole of unburned within that 100,000 plus acre fire. Those largely U.S. Forest Service Angel underburn units. So they had been treated that way. And then I think some of the containment lines that were onto state ownership, that it shows the active management. They weren't prescribed burned, but they were, kind of parked out recent timber harvests that provided some good opportunity to contain that fire, especially as it transitioned into lower elevation and drier fuels. We could be successful at actually stopping that there. So I think, both sides of it, some underburn stuff that had happened several years before, didn't want to carry fire, and then some active management that provided some opportunities for line.
Yeah, perfect. And that's why previously completed fuels treatments and wildfires are available as layers in the RMA dashboard and in WFDS. So when you're getting in there and you're starting to look across the landscape, if you have an ongoing wildfire, you can look at those for those opportunities. So great. So with that, we're going to actually go to breakouts. And I think we're going to, just for time's sake, cut this down to 10 minutes. So go ahead and break into your groups and talk about your thoughts on developing or maintaining a successful fuels program after these discussions that we've had. And we'll come back at 33 after the hour and have a little group discussion and then take a break. Okay. Hopefully everybody had a really good discussion. For the sake of time, let's just go. Do we have anybody who wants to offer up some of their thoughts on this before we kind of close the first half and take a little break? Okay, so just to kind of close this out, some of the key points that we really wanted to hit on here, obviously the proper sequencing and location of treatments. And some of this is actually that we've really moved to spatial planning, and that I think that really helps with doing kind of strategic planning and prioritization of treatments across the landscape. And a lot of those, like the risk analytics and other tools that have been discussed kind of help with that. And then making sure that you're using the right combination of treatments to meet your objectives. Sometimes it takes some research and toying with to get there. But there again, most places have already done that. So reach out to your neighbors or Google it. The fire effects information system is a good place to go to find out what kind of treatments are effective for different veg types and stuff. Really encourage that landscape level or comprehensive restoration planning or habitat management plans. And then Chris really hit on this, and this is high on my priority list, is maintaining your past treatments. Making sure that you're not letting a treatment that you spent $100,000 on to go in and do thinning and hand piling and pile burning, but then you never got around to prescribe burning it. And next thing you know, 15, 20 years later, you have to go in and do the cost of thinning and hand piling and pile burning again. So really wrap that into your program of work. And then the last thing is, and we haven't really discussed this, but monitoring is really important. Anytime we're doing treatments out there on the landscape, setting up some monitoring plots, just basic monitoring protocols. It's really important. A lot of times people go, oh yeah, that burned great. Well, that's not monitoring. It's like, okay, well, it burned great, but what was the response, 2 months later, 6 months later, a year later? Did you turn the whole field into a cheatgrass, meadow, which is probably not a good thing. So anyway, that's what we have there. Let's go ahead and take a quick break and be back at 45 after. So 10:45.
Todd, let's how about I propose we do a 15-minute break here, and then we'll just push through that second break, and we'll make up some time both in presentations and then also we can get maybe a little bit longer lunch. So we'll just kind of tack that break. So let's do a 15-minute break now. Let's call it 53 or sorry 53.
All righty. Welcome back, everybody. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the second part of this will be focused on prescribed fire. So we wanted to start with a quick breakout, just like a 5-minute breakout into your rooms and talk about your experience and comfort level with using prescribed fire. And then we'll jump back into the main room and get some feedback on that. So why don't you head out there, be back at like 59 after. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So just real quick from the groups, Megan's actually working on a poll to see where we are in terms of how comfortable folks are with low, between low, moderate, and high with prescribed fire. But in the meantime, what are some of the main concerns that came up in the groups? And let's start with maybe group 1. What were some of your main concerns related with prescribed fire?
I'll jump in there for group 1. Some of the concerns were just, varying levels of experience of those implementing plans, sensitive areas, culturally, just making sure that there's agreements and recognizing the local things. Personal liability insurance was brought up as, kind of a thing to increase comfort levels potentially. And then just, agency administrators are all going to have different levels of comfort as well, based on previous experience with prescribed fire programs or fire in general for implementation.
Perfect. Thanks. Yeah, you gave concerns and topics there. So you want to pick another group?
Let's go with the group 6.
Thank you.
I can go for group 6. This is Holly. So I think most people in our group were pretty comfortable with their roles in prescribed fire and, being a part of it. We do have a couple folks in our group that have worked on the Malheur National Forest where there were some social license issues, not even social license issues, but some legal issues with prescribed burning over the past couple of years. And so I think that definitely has people's tensions up. One of our group members mentioned that their line officer is really not comfortable with authorizing prescribed fire at certain times a year as a result of that incident on the Malheur. So I think social license is a big concern. One of the main things we discussed.
Great. Yeah, no, that's huge. So, all righty. Thanks. So Megan was able to get your comfort level for students in the course. If you can all go in and rate your comfort level, we will see what we come up with. And in the meantime, we'll just go on to the rest of the presentation. All right, so to start off, why is prescribed fire important? And we've talked about the tools in the toolbox and the different treatment types that are available, but generally speaking, prescribed fire usually is the most cost effective, and it also provides opportunities to plan when you put fire on the ground so you can mitigate smoke management concerns. Sometimes it always doesn't go real well. And you can usually treat more area faster than you can with other treatment types. It also it's just a natural ecological process, and it really modifies future fire behavior a little better than just thinning alone or pile burning or stuff like that. So but really it is, especially if you get into that maintenance mode and get the area into the desired conditions that you want, and then you're using prescribed fire as a maintenance treatment, getting that desired return interval in place. It really helps maintain the kind of a resilient ecosystem. So, but another important part is prescribed fire is a great place for our fighters and managers to learn about fire and learn about fire behavior. So it's a really good place to understand how you manipulate ignition patterns to get the desired intensities to get to your fire effects that you want, stuff like that. So it's pretty important. It's there's some areas where it's just like, well, no, we can't put fire in here, and understand that, and then just look to other treatment types that will kind of simulate prescribed fire, if you will. Moving on, really the key document that you're going to want to really look at, and just real quick, it looks like our poll results. So we have actually pretty good, moderate to high confidence level. 89% of the class is at least moderate to high and into the high zone. So that's good. Hopefully the folks in the low going through this, you'll get more comfortable with it. So again, there's just too much information to go over here. I'll just have to steer you. You're going to have this presentation, and this is a link to this, the PMS 484. And this is the Interagency Prescribed Fire Planning and Implementation Procedure Guide. This describes what's minimally acceptable, I want to highlight that minimally, because there is a lot more that you can bring in to a prescribed fire plan that helps inform and enhance the planning process. This guide also identifies the roles and responsibilities for you as a FMO or agency administrator. So key document, go in and take a good look at that. Something that's tiered off of this is the burn plan template. It's the PMS 484-1. It was updated in December of 2021. And that's kind of important to key into, because every couple years it seems, or this is updated, and then you're given a timeline to update your plans to that. But basically, this template spells out there's 21 elements that are required plus appendices. And then that guide talks through what each element is for and how to complete it. So just wanted to kind of just let you know what is in a template if you haven't seen a prescribed fire guide before. Now, looking at some of the another really important part of prescribed fire planning is the complexity analysis. So there was the complexity rating system guide that came out, the PMS 424. This is required along with the prescribed fire template. And this comes in two forms. The complexity analysis actually is intended to be the first step that you take when planning a prescribed fire. You sit down ultimately with whoever is proposing to do the prescribed fire and the agency administrator, and you walk through this complexity analysis, and you give risk ratings for certain things. You identify values at risk, areas of concern, all this stuff, and you go through and you do an initial kind of pre-plan rating of those, and that's a really critical step, because that gives the burn boss, the qualified burn boss who's going to prepare the plan, that information to start putting into the plan. Okay, how can we mitigate this? And if there are mitigation measures identified in that complexity analysis, making sure that those come into the prescribed fire plan, because then after the prescribed fire plan is completed, there's a final complexity analysis rating that is conducted, and that's intended so if you have a high risk rating pre-plan, maybe you've been able to mitigate and get it down to a moderate or a low. So the key to this is that if you identify those as an FMO or an agency administrator, when you're reviewing this, you need to cross-check and make sure that everything is aligned. So if you look at the initial complexity analysis, any mitigations, make sure it's in the prescribed fire plan, and then also it matches what was in the final rating as well. So that's really key, and being involved in that, in understanding the difference between the initial and final complexity ratings is extremely important. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about making sure to honestly rate the risks associated with prescribed fires. So, this does bring us back to that whole discussion that we had yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, on risk, and making sure that we effectively bring that in to this planning process. And both the preparer, technical reviewer, FMO, and the agency administrator are all in sync. All right, so a couple things, kind of like critical elements that we wanted to talk about real quick. So the burn plan preparer and technical reviewer. So a burn plan preparer, whoever prepares it and signs it, must be qualified as a burn boss at the complexity level of that burn. A trainee can help prepare it, but a qualified burn boss has to be the one that signs it. Technical reviewers, they must be qualified or previously qualified at that complexity level. Now, there's a little caveat here. We've discussed this in the fire use subcommittee. The Burn Boss Type 2 task book actually has conducting a technical review of a burn plan as a task, but in the guide it doesn't really open that up. So if you have a trainee, a Burn Boss trainee do it, there has to be a technical reviewer that is qualified or has been qualified at that level to actually sign off. So, and that is a good learning opportunity to allow trainees to conduct or be part of a technical review. So, also there's the signature page that the agency administrator approves, and the FMOs for at least the Forest Service and BLM are required to sign. And I just really encourage agency administrators and FMOs to do a very thorough review of all burn plans, which includes the complexity analysis associated with. So, and then there's the agency administrator ignition authorization. This is one that, in my opinion, should be done when you're in spitting distance of the prescribed fire, depending on the complexity level, because there's a number of questions that need to be covered and answered regarding conditions and weather and preparedness levels and drought and stuff like that. And Lawrence, I see you have your hand up. You have a question?
Yeah, just being in this class for that agency administrator role, and during the interview with the agency administrator, I'd asked a question regarding prescribed burns and on these plans. And what was suggested is, it's one thing to look at it and make sure the T's are crossed and the I's dotted, but also to read it with the lens that if something bad happens, this is the document that will be looked at in any review. And so to kind of have that in the back of your mind, is it solid for that scrutiny? That's
Yeah.
all. Thanks.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's why really emphasizing that we need to really do a thorough review at multiple levels to make sure that we're not missing anything there. And then as a FMO and agency administrator, you want to make sure that your burn boss is completing the required go, no go checklist, which is done, the day of each ignition day of that burn, where there's another series of questions and they're required to sign it. It's really recommended to have additional signatures like the holding specialist or ignition specialist. I used to do that all the time. I just call it my sanity check. Make sure I wasn't a crazy burn boss, going into a red flag day going, hey, let's go rip it up, but they confirm that they're on board and everything else too. Some of the key elements, pre-burn consideration and weather, making sure those are really tight on that. And obviously this has come up, I've heard that through the week, contingency planning. And, you gotta kind of plan for the worst. So be honest about this, use modeling to help you develop your resource needs and contingency plans, and really follow the guide and make sure that this is a strong element in there. Because if you get, hopefully you'll use this to avoid the element 18, how to declare a wildfire. And Chris is going to take us more in depth on that. So Chris, I'll hand it to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, timely question or comment there, Lorenz. We talked initially about risk, and we talked about landscapes and communities and the risk that's out there from hazardous fuels from a century of not having a fire in the landscape. With prescribed fire, that risk goes two ways. There's the risk of not doing things, and then there's the reality of the risk that when we implement prescribed fire, when we spend years planning something, write a burn plan, go out there and put fire in the landscape, there's always that risk that something might not go according to plan. On the Forest Service side, we average 4,500 prescribed fires a year. Those are individual prescribed fires. On average, 7 of those are declared wildfires. So that's a over 99% success rate. But those 7 instances that we have a prescribed fire declare a wildfire is incredibly stressful. They can be very significant in terms of their impacts. And they can also be very impactful for the local units, even if they don't have impacts, say what we saw like in New Mexico a couple years ago. For the people that are involved that have a prescribed fire declared a wildfire, there's a large amount of ownership and there's a large amount of stress that goes into that. So even if it doesn't hit the news, it's still a big deal for people's careers, and it's something that we need to take seriously. I would also say it's a mandatory part of the burn plan. We don't want this to happen, but just like we take medical incidents very seriously and we have a medical plan, we don't think that's what's going to happen. We don't plan that into our day, but we need to have a plan for when something like this happens. It's just the reality of putting fire on the landscape and doing the good work that we think we should do carries a certain amount of risk, and it needs to be planned for. We just kind of ended there on the contingency plan, the management action points. Whatever prescribed fire we're implementing, it should have a what if scenario. That's a requirement that we don't go straight from things are going great to it's a wildfire, but hey, if we have a problem, what are the resources it will take to, take care of that identified problem? What's the next logical fallback point that can still be within our general plan? And that needs to be communicated. It mentions the scope of the burn plan there. Going back to policy, different agencies or different parts of agencies even have different requirements. So say with the Forest Service, in Region 2 of the Forest Service, Intermountain Region, if you were in Colorado, if you had a prescribed fire and fire gets onto a private ownership and you don't have an agreement, even if it's a stump that catches on fire, that needs to be declared a wildfire. The policy there is that any fire off Forest Service becomes a wildfire. Not the case in Region 6, that's a conversation. So just making sure that, that burn plan, anyone who's implementing it, and it's good that we ask the question, how comfortable are you with prescribed fire? Because it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be an agency administrator that isn't quite sure what you're signing off on. I'd rather have an AA ask for, really clear walk through the burn plan, why through this is a good idea, than someone that's just kind of signing it because they think they're supposed to sign it. So having that clear, what is this burn plan and what are all the parameters associated with it? And how do we know when we're getting outside prescription, if we're getting outside the allowable burn area is critical. And then that authority. Someone needs to make that call. The burn plan is going to have an identified person or a role. It could be the agency administrator, it could be the burn boss, it could be the FMO, but there needs to be one person who has that responsibility. I'll be honest, a lot of times it turns into a conversation. You might have a burn plan that, a burn boss on scene makes that call very quickly. But there's a lot of times where this kind of gets spooled up and you have a couple of hours where you're kind of hemming and hawing, and there's going to be a lot of folks involved. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you have the time to have conversations, absolutely should be having those conversations as to what comes next and what's pushing you to make your decision or support you for whatever decision you're looking at. Okay, next slide. The main thing that comes out of the Interagency Prescribed Fire Guide, it gives you till the next burning period for your prescription parameters if they're exceeded and holding. So if you have, your prescription parameters, your flame lengths, your rates of spread, your weather prescription, if that changes and you're outside of prescription, you don't instantly declare a wildfire. You have that window of, hey, can you control this? Is there an obvious step down to securing this? And likewise for fire spread outside your unit. You have till the next burning period until you need to make that decision. Obviously, a lot of other factors at play there. I mentioned private land. You might have something barely get outside that unit and you need a certain amount of resources. It's going to take a certain amount of funding. And so you start having those conversations. Is it time to punch that? You might have that prearranged in your burn plan as far as if it hits this point, escapes past this management action point, we need to declare a wildfire. A lot of what's going to be pushing you to declare a wildfire is need for resources. If you had enough folks to get it within the first 24 hours, great. As you start looking at that next burning period, resources, funding, particularly use of aviation, things like that, is going to probably be forcing you to be thinking about declaring that wildfire. Again, good to have those conversations at the regional offices. We're usually going to be looking at, hey, what would it take if you just need a helicopter? Can we find you funding? Again, just being open and honest and making sure that you're communicating up goes a long way to giving you the support you need, both for the containment of that and also making sure that you're looking at all your options that you have in front of you. And next slide. If you do have a wildfire declaration, you're going to have certain notifications that are built into it. So at a minimum, you're going to have to report that up through your normal chain of command. And then once it becomes a wildfire, you're going to basically have two siloed communications. At least that's how it works for the Forest Service. Now it's a duty officer thing that the forest duty officer is going to report to the regional duty officer that we have a wildfire that is a prescribed fire declared a wildfire. At the same time, that acknowledgement on the line officer side is going to be going from, in our case on the Forest Service, the forest supervisor to the regional forester to the Washington office, acknowledging not only do we have a wildfire, but that was a prescribed fire that became a wildfire. So a little extra communication when we have a wildfire that is a result of agency actions. Additionally, you might have a bunch of notifications that you've signed yourself up for. If you have, local fire departments, local protection districts, acknowledging not just that you're going to make those notifications, but who's doing that. Everyone's going to be very busy when this starts to happen. You're going to be getting a lot of phone calls. People like me in the regional office are going to be trying to track down, what we need to know. So having a clear, hey, is it dispatch that's going to be calling those folks? Is it the duty officer? Making sure you have a clear plan for notifications and how that will go. Pretty critical for a wildfire declaration. And next slide. And as already acknowledged, there will be a review. We had 5 escapes last year in Region 6, which was an anomaly. We normally have maybe 1 every other year. Last year with 5, we had to do a lot of reviews this winter. And I will say one thing that we really tried to do with our prescribed fire review was to make sure that folks know that, we're not the prescribed fire police. If there was completely negligent action and people went and, violated policy or did things, that they knew to be wrong as they were doing it, that's going to be one set of ramifications. But if folks were doing what they, put in the burn plan and everyone was following, best management practices and following the letter of the law as far as all of our policy goes, it's a learning experience. This is our ability to say like, hey, very much like an FLA, what happened? Why did it happen? Get the story of the people that were there and be able to share that. Give the folks there some closure, but also make sure if there's a lesson to be learned, we don't want to cover that up. We don't want to say, hey, we had these issues with this modeling, or we had this issue over here. Those are good things that should be going out. All those review goes to the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. So I'd say, embrace that as much as you can. It's not going to be necessarily a fun experience to kind of rehash and go through all that stuff. But it is an opportunity to learn from it and to get some closure from it and to look at it from a larger lens. And next slide. So some common denominators, and I got some kind of examples from this last year. These are some kind of more national, bigger ones, but that first one, conditions not normal. We're increasingly seeing not normal is the new normal. This last year, we had 2 escapes in the spring, and both were a result of fires that had been done significantly earlier. We often think, prescribed fire turning into a wildfire is something that happens quickly. And in a lot of cases, people don't declare soon enough is something that came out of the Chiefs Review a few years ago, that, things are deteriorating, but there's a sense that we don't want to declare because declare is a black eye. And so they might hold on too long. But the average time for the Forest Service between ignitions to declaration is 28 days. And that's kind of what happened this last spring, where we had 2 prescribed fires, one in May, one in June, that we went into July and suddenly it was over 100 degrees early July for an extended period of time. That's something that's kind of an abnormality historically. But to these days, it's suddenly something that, it seems to be popping up. We tend to get heat domes and things in July that suddenly the residual burning that was going on, that stuff that was maybe creeping around, now has got maybe a bunch of needles that have fallen. It's got some unburned duff. It's got things that suddenly under 100-degree heat reburns all over the place. And then we get some areas that didn't burn, actively burning. We get torching. So it was really interesting to see like multiple units. There's also additional units that burned that We're not declared wildfires that we got resources to, but spring burning now is something that can heat up and change pretty quickly on us. Fuel loading, that's something that, we mentioned cheatgrass. You might write a burn plan that had one grass fuel loading, say in a grass predominant fuel type. You could have a wet spring that leads to a big grass year. That making sure that the fuel loading in your burn plan and the modeling that you did actually matches what's in your unit. We sometimes tend to roll over burn plans for a couple of years. If there's changes to fuel loading, which therefore is changes to your modeling, changes to your organization, your contingency, all that needs to be reflected. So really revisit your burn plans and make sure that the burn plan you're working with is representative of what's actually out on the unit. Weather is always changing. Winds are always going to be problematic. We need to burn with some amount of wind usually, but the Weather Service does an amazing job giving us accurate forecasts up to the point they can. But sometimes wind shifts happen, and wind is a big driver as far as things that get outside the unit. And I kind of jumped over the conditions outside the unit. Another big one there with just ensuring that you're not looking at just what you're trying to burn, but what's that, hey, if we do have a problem, have we accurately modeled what's outside that unit? Something that IFTDIS does pretty well as far as giving you that, you want to buffer it. You want to look at what's outside the unit, not just inside the unit. And then complexity analysis. One thing with prescribed fire compared to wildfire, in wildfires, we have an incentive to order everything you want. If you get a fire, just start ordering resources. Obviously, that's being a little facetious and there's some caps on that. But if you need resources for a wildfire, you order the resources, you let the system play out and get you what you think you can get. From a prescribed fire standpoint, there's almost an incentive to do it with the minimum organization. If you build too big an organization and you can't staff it, you might not be able to implement your burn plan. If you have a limited budget and you can only bring in so many folks and you can only afford so much overtime, the difference between prescribed fire and some of the limitations we have compared to wildfire, I think is a factor as far as, what we anticipate an organization should look like. And then as I mentioned, the patrol phase there, 28 days is often how long it takes between when we, have a prescribed fire to when it gets out. Just knowing that when you have a prescribed fire, that the chain of custody needs to continue because you've completed ignitions. Until that is declared out and you are confident it is out, it needs to be owned by a prescribed fire burn boss or the duty officer or someone who has responsibility for that. And it needs to continue to be checked and maintained. Sometimes they can kind of fall off the radar as we get busy, but that's a common denominator of things that get out. And to the question, common theme associated with the 5 escapes, we just completed the reviews. They're all still in draft form, but that's something the region is going to look at this year as far as we gather them all up, put them together. What are the common denominators? Are there things that are unique to them? Are there things that are consistent? So more to come on that, probably better be part of next year's class. I don't think we'll have anything in the near term for that, but definitely working on that. Okay, Todd, turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Going to have to triage here because we're running over. These next few slides just kind of reiterated a lot of what we were already talking about in terms of, pre-season planning and communication and everything like that. You could go ahead and look at these bullet points. I think we've covered all the, policy and understanding your roles and responsibilities to be successful. There is something that I wanted to get to, and we're going to have to forgo this group discussion. I actually really wanted to get to unplanned ignitions because this one brought up a lot of discussion last year. And, the 2009 federal fire policy, really opened the door to use all the tools in the toolbox for unplanned fires, from monitor to full perimeter control. So, there's a lot of saying out there, is it time to manage wildfire with wildfire? And some of the discussions that we've had with, really developing a well thought out fuels management program is opening the ability to actually managing more wildfire, right? Building those catchers and allowing for that decision space and time so we can, get some fire out there on the ground to do good work. Of course, at the right times. But in order to do this, you really have to be thoughtful, and it's something that you have to plan over a series of years and have the skill set in there in terms of, you know, fire planners and fire analysts and whatnot. So I just kind of wanted to open it up real quick, because we're gonna have to close out here pretty fast. Any thoughts on that? On using unplanned ignitions, no matter what you call it, you know, using a, you know, confinement strategy, point protection, you know, multiple objectives, whatever. Any thoughts on that?
Hey, Todd, you know, one thought that comes to mind for me is, you know, there's a lot of opportunity for that. And the reality is that if we're going to catch up in the, you know, prescribed fire / fuels management world, we're going to have to utilize as many opportunities as we can take. I think a key piece of it too is you guys mentioned earlier planning at the landscape scale, or at least being cognizant of how your pieces fit in at the landscape scale. So identifying those catcher's mitts and those critical pieces that have to be carried out, with fine control and a lot of investment versus in the future maybe including some of those burn units in between those types that require less management, because now you have a nice big rind of prescribed fuels treatments. It's an opportunity to take advantage of it both in the wildfire and the prescribed fire context if we're planning correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, and Kevin just put in the chat that he doesn't think the state of Washington can legally do that. And I think that that is true. But I have stood out there on the landscape and looked across at a wildfire on the Olympic National Forest and developed a plan that used alternative strategies to use road infrastructure outside, you know, of the forest on state lands. So, of course, they're not saying we're using it for resource benefit or anything like that. So anyway, we could probably talk for hours on this one. Kevin, do you have something?
Oh, yeah, I was saying I mean, we can use indirect strategies because it's a higher probability of success or for safety, but we just can't really do it in order to do fuels reduction, land management. So, I mean, it's a nuance there, and it's kind of how you sell it sometimes. But I mean, if we're trying to intentionally burn up areas just to achieve prescribed fire, I don't believe we can do that.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, and yeah, it's difficult. So
I guess one thing I'll add real quick is because you didn't manage it for that, and you know that was not an intent, and you could be, you know, fighting tooth and nail to put that fire out. As far as looking at your fuels management program, I think one thing that we need to do better at is looking at the fires that we've had and looking at those. Well, that was an investment. You know, we talk about maintenance, and there's places where we've had great effects from a fire, and capitalizing on that and saying, well, you know what, we hadn't planned a prescribed fire in there, but you know what, now that we've had those condition changes, you know, put that on your radar as, you know, that's 10 years from now, we should be looking to get back in there. You know, look at the totality of your landscape and maybe things that you didn't see as opportunities that suddenly show up out of nowhere.
well, we could probably talk for hours on that, but just real quick to wrap up, you know, in terms of reporting requirements and monitoring, the Department of Interior came up with the with IFPERS, the Interior Fuels and Post Fire Reporting System, which is spatial first reporting system that came out last year. It's fully implemented with all the bureaus currently. And then the Forest Service used FACTS database. And then there is the IFTDIS, the Interagency Fuel Treatment Decision Support System, that not only has a lot of good like modeling tools and other products that would help support your prescribed burn plans, but also has the FTIM, the Fuel Treatment Effectiveness Monitoring. So, and then I talked about monitoring earlier, that it's really important to get something in place to do some monitoring. And with that, I think we've blown our time out of the water, but if there are any questions or discussions, put them in the chat and we can follow up on it. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Chris. Apologies to the group. Your meeting facilitator had a 30 million acre typo earlier and then a 60-minute miscalculation while we were looking at the glide path here. So apparently math isn't my forte, at least not today. So next up, we're going to go ahead and jump into scenario overview with Eric. And then we will combine our breakouts with our lunch break and plan on being back at 1300 Pacific time. I'll put that in the chat. But Eric, if you want to go ahead and set us up for the scenario.